Hi, welcome to Miss Richardson's U.S. History 5-Minute Lectures. This information is U.S. Note 6.8, Reagan Scandals. It includes information aligned with the second section on your Unit 6 study guide. Now remember, you control the lecture. Use your study guide to figure out what's important, pause, write down any questions you have, and rewatch as often as you need to. Let's go ahead and get started. In the last set of notes, you learned about President Reagan's policies. Now I want you to learn about the two big scandals of his presidency, the savings and loan crisis and the Iran-Contra scandal. So the savings and loan crisis, or the savings and loan scandal, was actually caused by a Reagan policy. It was inadvertent, but it resulted in 747 savings and loan institutions closing. So what happened? Well, I'm glad you asked. I'm going to tell you. Remember when I told you about how Reagan deregulated many businesses in the 80s? Well, one, which closed what he considered loopholes in the tax code, took away subsidies or extra money for rental housing developers. This went into effect retroactively, which means that it affected people who had already had the loans in place. That meant that developers who relied on that tax break actually didn't have enough money to pay their loans, which meant they went bankrupt. And then the savings and loan businesses that had lent them the money lost all that money they'd loaned out. So many of these savings and loans could not take multiple failed loans, and they ended up closing. That meant that the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which had been created after the stock market crash, the bank crash of the 1930s, had to cover all the money owed, or at least a large portion of it. So the U.S. ended up even further in debt, as they had to pay out, ultimately, $125 billion, with a B, $125 billion of the total $150 billion in lost money. So while the savings and loan scandal cost the country financially, the Iran-Contra scandal cost the government the trust of the public. So now, the Iran-Contra scandal. The events of this scandal occurred between 83 and 88. During this time, there were communist forces trying to take over the Nicaraguan government. So as you learned in earlier notes, Reagan had gone back to the policy of containment and did not want to let this happen. He asked Congress for money to send to support the Contras, who were a rebel group fighting the communists in Nicaragua. So Congress denied Reagan the funds he requested, because remember, we were already really in debt and spending on a deficit. Now, Reagan still wanted to help fight the communists. So several military personnel during this time, after this request happened, were then used to facilitate trades that could be used to help the Contras. Oliver North, who was a colonel at the time, was seen as the principal facilitator. These men traded weapons to Iran. Remember, we were supporting Iraq in the Iran-Iraq War. So they traded weapons to Iran in exchange for hostages and money. They then turned around, the hostages came home, they sent the money then to the Contras in Nicaragua to fund that fight. The money never went through Congress, it was never part of the U.S. budget, and so this was a very secret deal, and that was what made it a little shady and questionable. Very questionable. So when the information came out, Oliver North was the only person charged and convicted. He spent time in prison for his role, though through the whole thing he just claimed that he was following orders and was authorized to do everything that he did. So this scandal tainted Reagan's presidency further than the savings crisis had. Now, did Reagan know about the deals? Did he order them? Evidence eventually proved that Reagan did know the arms were traded for hostages. However, no evidence ever came out that suggested he knew about the money being traded and then sent to the Contras. Now, whether he knew or not, this scandal, as well as the savings and loan crisis, tarnished Reagan's presidency. And this is the end of U.S. Note 6.8, so hopefully you learned something, and I'll see you in class with any questions you have.